It's official, we know who Y-Man is. Or I guess I should say, we know what Y-Man is. And after 229, we're starting to see why Y-Man is. And when, and where, and how. So one of the first questions you probably have is, was this the best possible outcome? I mean, you have to understand, this reveal was almost 5 years in the making. That's 5 years of people desperately theorizing who and what was behind the petrification. In that time, people came up with a bunch of their own predictions and agendas. So in this video, I want to address some of the more popular takes and explain why this particular one was the best possible outcome. To be clear, I plan on diving deeper into how well this reveal works in another video. For now, we're just gonna look at whether this was the best scenario Inagaki could have gone with. As I'm sure most of you knew before you clicked on this video, there'll be some pretty big spoilers going forward. But before I get started, make sure to comment with your thoughts on the Y-Man reveal. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week in the next video. This week's comment goes to Party Jams, who shared their thoughts on Shura from Eden Zero. If you'd like more Dr. Stone and other manga discussions like this one, then make sure to subscribe and follow along with each week's video. Now, before we look at any Y-Man theories, we have to make one thing clear. Realism is one of the most fundamental principles of Dr. Stone. There are a few exceptions to this, like the main character having a vegetable head or the villain punching a lion in the face, but for the most part, Dr. Stone is governed by the current rules of science. In other words, if it hasn't been proved or theorized yet, or nobody's actually invented it, you're not going to see it. Obviously, this is no accident because Inagaki very deliberately makes sure that the characters are using real-world science to solve their problems. It's also why he said on 2 separate occasions now that the reboot is non-canon. And as much as that makes me question my very existence, I have to admit that it's probably for the best. Because part of the beauty of the science in Dr. Stone is that it isn't just a big elaborate proxy for the characters having magic powers. This is the same kind of stuff that we can see in our world, which makes the story that much more real. So with that context in mind, I knew whenever I saw certain theories that they just weren't going to happen. For example, some people had the theory that Y-Man was Senku or some other character that had traveled back in time to take over the world. Ignoring the fact that time travel usually just makes your head hurt, you could tell this was never going to happen, because time travel, at least as far as modern science is concerned, just isn't something we can do. At least not how you might see it in something like Dragon Ball. We do have multiverse theory, which is supported by plenty of scientists, and there are instances where time is altered by the effects of gravity, but that's all incredibly advanced science. In the context of fictional stories, that kind of science can very easily lead into the realm of science fiction. And while Dr. Stone is science fiction in the sense that we don't have parasitic AI sensu beans, it's also not science fiction for the reasons we discussed earlier. So that's why time travel or similar theories would have completely ruined the story. If the characters suddenly needed to overcome this kind of unrealistic obstacle, then that would undermine all their prior struggles that they had to overcome with actual science. In turn, it'd make the whole story seem kinda pointless in retrospect. But now that I just said all that, let me give you the one science fiction theory that could work. The one theory that could kind of work is something like the Medusas just mysteriously appearing from outer space. That wouldn't be the worst thing, because then at least there'd still be some mystery, and we the readers could come up with our own theories. But the problem with a theory like this is that it's kind of touchy. See, one of the big reasons why the reboot isn't canon is because, without too many spoilers, there's stuff in that story that is possible in theory but isn't completely realistic. So if the Medusas just popped out of nowhere, or worse, if they were sent here by aliens or space travelers, then that would pretty much spit in the face of Inagaki's stance on the reboot. It'd basically be like picking and choosing when to use real science. The reboot isn't outside the realm of possibility, but because it could mess with the main plot, it's meant to be viewed as non-canon. But all of a sudden, when you need an explanation for your miraculous AI parasites, oh well, they came from outer space. See what I mean? It wouldn't be the worst thing, but this kind of outcome would be just a little too convenient, especially considering everything else has such a solid explanation. Except for Byakuya seeing the ISS, but that's a rant for another video. Actually, while we're on the topic of Senku's dad, let's move on to the more realistic theories. Admittedly, it's been a hot minute since I've heard this one, but some people theorize that Y-Man was Senku's biological father. And when I first heard this idea, I was actually kind of for it, but that lasted for about 3 seconds before I realized why it wouldn't really work. See, whenever you do this "the villain was closer than you think" trope, it's generally done as a way to push the main character. They see that they're related to the villain, begin to question their identity, but ultimately realize they're their own person. And while I'm sure this kind of development would have had some kind of influence on Senku, the reality is that Senku couldn't care less about his identity. He's all about being practical and getting things done. So a revelation like "Senku, I am your father" would probably go right over that tall head of his. Now, a more general theory is that Y-Man was some kind of scientist, like Dr. Zeno, that saw science as the ultimate solution to everyone's problems. Of course, there's 1,000 different versions of this, but that's the basic idea. And I'll be the first to admit that I was on board with this theory, because so much of Dr. Stone has been about using science for good instead of evil, balancing one's desires with the goal of benefiting society as a whole. So defeating some kind of morally gray scientist would naturally lead to a conversation where the characters reach the conclusion that you can advance science without doing it at the expense of the masses. Well, this would have been the case if we still had Tsukasa and Ryusui going to the moon. Tsukasa, someone who's against vested interests, could have offered his take on how he's learned that science can be used for good in the right hands. Then Ryusui, as we've seen him say himself, could have added some bit about how desire should serve the interests of others. But then Tsukasa gave his spot to Kohaku and Ryusui gave his to Stanley. Ryusui still came along, but now he's only watching from the sidelines. So when you have Kohaku, a grade A meathead, and Stanley, someone who only has a bachelor's of science in how to shoot someone in the face, then the only real potential for a talk no jutsu is between Y-Man and Senku. And as we all know, Senku isn't exactly one for conversation. Anytime he's had some kind of persuasive talk with a villain, it usually comes in the form of exactly one sentence. So while there was a lot of potential for this kind of Y-Man, the reality is that it became less and less likely as we approached the big reveal. Not to say that it was unlikely, but the potential for what that kind of villain could contribute began to shrink in the chapters leading up to 228. Now, obviously, I've only named a few of the big theories, so if there's one I missed, then share it in the comments, and let me know why you think it either would or would not have worked. But now it's time to address the actual theory, or rather the reality that is Y-Man. Speaking of which, kudos to MatPat for hitting the nail on the head. It's actually crazy how consistent his video is like 2.5 years later. But like I said, we're not here to examine how well this explanation works. The only question we're looking at is, was this the best possible scenario? Well, let's contrast it with the other theories. Unlike time travel, AI is a scientific reality that's consistent with the story's focus on realism. You could argue that AI being the villain is kinda cliché in a scientific story like Dr. Stone, but it's not nearly as cliché as something like Senku's biological father being the villain. Finally, while having a morally gray scientist be the final boss had tons of potential to expand on the story's themes, you could argue that it'd be redundant considering we already had Dr. Zeno. Plus, I only realized it after the big reveal, but this AI obstacle actually presents a possible ending that would be the perfect way to link back to everything that led to these final moments. But real quick, just before I do that, I want to just address the question of where the Medusas came from. Now, as I'm recording this, it's unclear where exactly they came from, so I'm just gonna assume that they were invented by scientists somewhere on Earth. I just think this would be a better explanation because while the whole "they came from outer space" thing would be cool and mysterious, I think it would just be needlessly divisive. But like I said, we'll get into that in a future video. So now, what do I mean when I say that AI present a perfect ending? Well, consider the broader narrative so far. Two of the biggest themes in the story have been using science for good instead of evil, and the value of personal desire. Now consider the relationship between the Medusas and the humans. The Medusas are these advanced AI organisms, but are only defined by their single purpose of advancing their species, which can only be done with humans. The humans, on the other hand, are free to create their own purpose based on their own desires, but the pursuit of those desires inevitably leads to the advancement of science and ultimately right back to the Medusas. Because of the Medusas, the story has come full circle. We started with Senku versus Tsukasa, science versus man, but now we have Senku versus the Medusas, man versus science. And on top of that, this relationship with the Medusas is the perfect metaphor for our relationship with science. Science, as the laws of the universe, has no purpose. It just exists. It's only when humans seek to understand those laws that they're given any meaning outside of their existence. So hopefully you can see why this is the best possible scenario Inagaki could have gone with. Now, do I know exactly where this is headed? No, not really. But if all goes well, Dr. Stone will ultimately offer some kind of meta discussion about the same idea that's been present in the story from the very beginning: mankind and its relationship with science. And that's it for this discussion. If you enjoyed this discussion, then make sure to like the video. Hopefully I was able to show you why this was the best possible outcome. Like I said, make sure to share some of the other Y-Man theories in the comments. And if you'd like to see that future Y-Man video, then make sure to subscribe so you can watch it as soon as it comes out. Thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.